Whisperin Jim Smith was an Old West detective, deputy, and stone-cold killer. And despite spending the majority of his life wearing a badge, his methods were, well, just a tad bit unorthodox. Like the time over in Sydney, Nebraska, when he got into it with a gambler. Both of them went for their guns, and moments later, the gambler was lying on the floor of the saloon, clutching his belly. He would survive, but he turned up missing just a few months later. Word on the streets was that Smith caught up with him out on the prairie and finished what he started. There was no proof, so Smith never faced any real consequences. But he was rumored to have dispatched many a man in a similar fashion, possibly as many as 30. From New Orleans to Wyoming, Arizona, Nebraska, and dang near everywhere in between, Jim Smith dealt in death, even well into his 70s. And despite having a best-selling novel and several movies bearing his name, Whisperin Jim remains, to this day, a relatively unknown figure. And I'm not really sure why. I mean, Smith was described by contemporaries as having written more red history with his pistol than any two men of his time. A man who had enough dead outlaws to his credit to start a fair-sized graveyard. Hell, even his own friend, the famed author Edgar Bronson, claimed that Smith was the, quote, very incarnation of a relentless, inexorable, indomitable, avenging Nemesis. Oh boy. Who was Whisperin Jim Smith? How'd he come to be such a feared gunman? Did he really whisper? Is it true that he once backed down both Pat Garrett and Bat Masterson? And why did he choose to undergo such a painful death? My name's Josh, and this is the Wild West Extravaganza. I know I say this a lot, but there's just not a ton of information out there on old Whisperin Jim Smith. And partly that's due to his name. I mean, how many James Smiths are there, right? Might as well be looking for a John Doe. Also doesn't help matters none that there were other gunfighters with the same name. At least 5, according to historian Robert K. D'Arment. Now that said, Smith is thought to have been born in Maryland sometime around the year 1838. His full name, by the way, was James Lewis Smith. He reportedly killed a gambler on a Mississippi riverboat at some point in the early 1860s, and then went on to serve in the Navy during the Civil War. Once again, not a lot in the way of details concerning Smith's early life, including his time in the service. There are also sources showing that he was an artillery officer. But whatever the case, we do know that he eventually found his way to Louisiana, where he possibly worked for the Freedmen's Bureau before joining the New Orleans Metropolitan Police Department in 1868. And that's when things start to clear up a little. Smith rose steadily through the ranks and managed to make detective within just 5 years. That's also about the same time that he got married, on Valentine's Day, to a 27-year-old Anna Mannion. Now, the following year, Detective Smith and his partner, Thomas Devereaux, were engaged in a shootout with suspected burglars. Apparently, the Alexander brothers, Munson and Benjamin, had taken to robbing homes over there in New Orleans. And eventually, Smith and Devereaux figured out where the brothers were living and forced their way inside. Benjamin surrendered almost immediately, but Munson put up a fight. And despite being shot at least 3 times, he still managed to escape. Temporarily, at least. A couple of days later, Smith and his partner were staking out one of Munson's hideouts, and when he finally appeared at around 3 a.m., they hollered for him to surrender. Munson instead went for his pistol, so Smith and Devereaux let loose with their shotguns. And even though the majority of the buckshot ended up squarely in Munson's back, the shooting was deemed justifiable. Whisperin Jim was even promoted to warden of the New Orleans workhouse. Now, this is kind of crazy. I've never heard of a workhouse before, but that's basically where they stuck the vagrants. And the term vagrant could mean a lot of things there in New Orleans in the mid to late 19th century. If you were homeless, unemployed, addicted to drugs or alcohol, even if your only crime was disturbing the peace or being of quote-unquote questionable moral character, you could wind up in one of these work homes. On one hand, I guess it's good they didn't just lock them up with all the murderers and rapists. But on the other hand, they were essentially just rounding up people who were down on their luck and tossing them into forced labor camps, including orphans. Nevertheless, this would be just a temporary assignment for Smith. You see, the killing of Munson Alexander just wouldn't go away. Rumors began circulating that Jim and his partner had set the whole thing up and murdered the man in cold blood. There were even those who swore they heard Smith bragging about it. The rumors became so widespread that a hearing was eventually held at the municipal police court, but both Smith and Devereaux were ultimately cleared of all charges. And that's about when Smith bid New Orleans adieu. Guess things were getting a little too hot, or maybe he just felt bitter over the allegations. I'm not really sure which. Either way, he and his bride would head to Omaha, Nebraska, where Smith found work as a detective for the Union Pacific Railroad. According to historian Frank Prassel, in his book The Western Peace Officer, quote, "No company's police have a more distinguished past than the rail detectives. Single guards and detectives certainly served the railroad when its first tracks reached out from Nebraska to Utah. Pinkerton men were regularly employed as police into the 1870s. But by 1880, divisions along the line maintained undercover operatives and investigators such as James Smith. Times were dangerous, stakes were high, and the railroad policemen often worked alone." End of quote. And yeah, just like Prassel said, it wasn't long before Smith became one of the more well-known rail detectives. Hell, he did such a good job there in Omaha that they transferred him to Cheyenne, where he was appointed as a special policeman. That was a pretty common practice back in those days for railroad detectives. It was basically just a formality that allowed them to make arrests, much in the same way that local sheriffs were often given deputy marshal commissions so they could operate outside their usual jurisdictions. What wasn't all that common was using said authority to steal money, which, as it turns out, is exactly what Smith was accused of doing in February of 1879. Story goes that he apprehended a drunk for disturbing the peace, and once the guy sobered up, he realized that his money was gone. There was an internal investigation, and when a newspaper editor by the name of J.G. Mills came forward, backing up the victim's claims, the mayor of Cheyenne revoked Smith's special police authority. And guilty or not, Jim's bosses at the Union Pacific were forced to transfer him back to Nebraska. He departed Cheyenne with what historian Robert D. Arment described as, quote, "bitter feelings against the newspaperman Mills, and a determination to get even," end quote. Now, it's worth noting that Mills had previously charged Smith with being a coward as well. So yeah, he was definitely going to have a reckoning with old J.G. Mills in the not-too-distant future. In the meantime, though, he was assigned to the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, where authorities were having a hell of a time dealing with thieves and rustlers, especially those led by Doc Middleton and the curiously named Lame Johnny. Now, Lame Johnny's real name was Cornelius Donahue, but he'd oftentimes go by the alias of John Hurley. And they called him lame on account of having two malformed legs that hindered his ability to walk. The man could ride a horse, though. He actually worked as a cowboy down in Texas before graduating to stock theft sometime in the 1870s. He was drawn to the Black Hills, just like everybody else, hoping to strike it rich. But when that didn't pan out, he formed a gang of cutthroats and took to robbing stagecoaches. Now, the chief law dog over there at Pine Ridge was William H. Llewellyn. I got no idea what the double H's stood for, but if a man's got two middle initials, he's got to be important, right? The only problem was Llewellyn didn't have a whole lot of experience hunting down bad guys, which is why he ended up calling on Whisperin Jim for assistance. That said, neither of them would end up arresting Lame Johnny. Turns out the Army did that for him after Johnny and one of his buddies tried to sell stolen horses down at Fort Robinson. And when Whisperin Jim was tasked with escorting the prisoners to Rapid City for trial, he chose to do so one at a time. I don't know, maybe he felt like guarding two prisoners all by himself would be a little too dangerous, or maybe, just maybe, Jim had other plans. Now, he and Johnny caught a stage at the Red Cloud Agency in late June of 1879. And later on that evening, around about dark, they were stopped by 8 armed vigilantes. Smith would later state that it was obviously not a holdup and that the men were looking to abscond with Lame Johnny. And rather than protect his prisoner, Smith just went ahead and turned him over to the mob. Vigilantes then led Johnny away about 100 yards and strung him up from the nearest tree limb. And yeah, after this, rumors began to spread that Smith was in cahoots with the lynch mob and that he never intended to deliver Johnny to the courts in the first place. Hell, there were even rumors that he wired ahead to let the killers know the exact location to stop the stage. Luckily for the other prisoner, Frank Harris, he was eventually delivered to the proper authorities without incident. Now, I don't know for certain that Smith was conspiring with the vigilantes, but this would sort of be a reoccurring theme throughout the rest of his life. While Jim did indeed garner a reputation as a gunfighter, most of his known gunfights are completely lost to history. All that's left is a whole lot of people who ended up dying under mysterious circumstances. More on that in just a bit. But for now, Whisperin Jim set his sights on the notorious Doc Middleton. I've actually spoken a bit about Doc on previous episodes, but he had been stealing horses ever since he was like 14 years old. He did a few stints in prison, he killed a soldier over in Nebraska during a bar fight, but he was mostly known as a horse thief. Matter of fact, I'm not aware of a more prolific horse thief in all of the Old West. I mean, hell, Middleton was reported to have stolen over 20,000 horses during his career. And yeah, he was up next on Whisperin Jim's chopping block. Only question is, would Middleton live long enough to see the inside of a courtroom? Smith organized a posse in March of 1880, but he returned empty-handed after about a week in the field. Following month, he joined forces with a pair of local sheriffs, and this time, they were able to track Middleton and his gang to their camp just due west of Sidney, Nebraska. And rather than attack the camp and risk Doc escaping, they instead bribed a local ne'er-do-well, Charlie Reed, to lure Middleton into town. Now, Reed was a guest at the Sidney jail waiting trial, so they offered to drop the charges if he would cooperate. Only thing is, Doc Middleton didn't fall for it. He turned down the invitation, but he did allow another member of the gang to accompany Reed back into Sidney. And just as soon as they came trotting into town, Whisperin Jim opened fire, killing Middleton's associate almost instantly. And by the time he and the posse rode out to Doc's camp, he was already long gone. Now that turncoat Reed ended up in jail again after getting drunk and shooting a local by the name of Henry Loomis. And when Loomis eventually died, a lynch mob descended on the jail and hanged Reed from a telegraph pole. Per Robert D. Arment, quote, local legend credits Whisperin Smith with participation in Reed's departure. Following his suspected complicity in the Lame Johnny lynching, there was a widely held view that Smith had a tendency to enforce his own sense of justice through the hangman's noose. End of quote. Now, Smith and H. Llewellyn were able to eventually catch up to Middleton and arrest him without incident, mostly on account of Doc being wounded in a gunfight just a week prior. They then brought him to Cheyenne to await trial. Now, if Smith really was behind the deaths of Reed and Lame Johnny, I'm not really sure why he didn't also eliminate Doc on the way to Wyoming. I don't know, maybe Llewellyn was around and he didn't want any witnesses. Or maybe Smith had more pressing concerns over in Cheyenne. Remember that newspaperman J.G. Mills who caused him to lose his special police authority? But Whisperin Jim had not forgotten about that. And no sooner was he back in Cheyenne that he began investigating Mills' background, just trying to dig up some dirt. And believe it or not, he was successful. He soon obtained a written statement alleging that Mills had been a member of the Ku Klux Klan down in Mississippi, and he'd even killed a black dude. So naturally, Smith shared this information all over Cheyenne, just being a messy little bitch and hoping to ruin Mills' reputation. And when Mills confronted him and asked that he retract the allegations, Smith asked him if he was armed. Mills replied that he was not, so Jim told him to, quote, go get your gun. Luckily for Mills, he wisely declined the offer and lived to see another day. Now, in March of 1880, a large shipment of gold arrived in the town of Sidney. And when a large portion of it came up missing, it was Detective Smith who was sent in to solve the case. Remember, he had previously worked in Sidney, so he was well acquainted with its residents, one of whom was a former sheriff turned saloon owner named Con McCarty. No relation, as far as I know, to Henry McCarty. Apparently, Con had a large group of hard cases that he palled around with. And it was this group that Smith suspected of stealing the gold. He started building a case, but only one of them, Chester Allen, ended up being prosecuted. Nevertheless, McCarty and his pals didn't much appreciate all this attention. Per historian Robert D. Arment, quote, Allen's trial was in progress on May 24, 1880, when Jim Smith tangled with one of the McCarty outfit. This episode of the Wild West Extravaganza is brought to you by ExpressVPN. Look, I'm going to be straight with you. Going online without ExpressVPN is like putting all of your passwords and credit card numbers on a huge billboard for the entire world to see. Every time you connect to an unencrypted network, whether you're in a cafe, a hotel, an airport, what have you, your online data is not secure. Any hacker on that same network can gain access and steal all of your personal data. Seriously, there's people out there making big money doing just that very thing, stealing data and then selling it on the dark web. That's where ExpressVPN comes into play. They stop the hackers by creating a secure, encrypted tunnel between your device and the internet. And the best part is it's super easy to use. You just fire up the app, click one button, and boom, you're protected. ExpressVPN also works on all of your devices, your phone, your laptop, your tablet, and a lot more. This way you can stay secure on the go. Now, everybody has different reasons for doing what they do. I personally use the VPN both on my phone and laptop just to help keep my business more secure. It's just an extra level of protection, especially now that I'm sort of out in the public, and I would definitely recommend you doing the same. So what are you waiting on? Secure your online data today by visiting expressvpn.com/wildwest. That's expressvpn.com/wildwest to find out how you can get up to 4 extra months free. expressvpn.com/wildwest. Now, let's get back to the show. While taking a drink in one of the town's saloons, he got into a heated argument with Patsy Walters. Both men went for their guns, but Smith got his pistol into action first. He plugged Walters once in the belly and missed with a follow-up shot. But before falling to the floor, Walters triggered off several rounds. One of his bullets struck Smith's revolver and glanced off, injuring his hand. Now, Smith's immediate concern was retaliation from the remainder of McCarty's buddies. And considering that his shooting hand was out of commission, he hauled ass and sought refuge over in his hotel room. And when the sheriff showed up to arrest him, Smith said he'd surrender the following morning after he'd received medical treatment. He also demanded that he be given a loaded rifle to keep in his jail cell. I guess Smith has spent so much time working with the vigilantes that he wanted to take certain precautions. And yeah, believe it or not, the sheriff agreed to his demands. Now, like I mentioned in the intro, the guy who Smith shot, Walters, he would end up recovering, and Smith was acquitted on grounds of self-defense. He spent the remainder of the year there in Sydney, mostly keeping a close eye on McCarty and his bunch. And it wasn't long before one of them, an old boy by the name of Dennis Flanagan, decided to try his luck. Apparently, Flanagan got drunk and started bragging that he was going to, quote, put out Smith's lights. And he got so drunk that he even went to Jim's hotel looking to confront him. And minutes later, Flanagan was lying on the floor in a puddle of his own blood. To hear Smith tell it, he was just lounging in bed when Flanagan forced his way inside, pistol in hand. At which point, he grabbed his own pistol and opened fire. And when the other hotel residents showed up to investigate, that's when they found Flanagan. Now, Flanagan would succumb to his wounds, but not before first giving a completely different story. To hear him tell it, he and Jim were just talking. He was actually just sitting down in a chair there in the hotel room when Smith all of a sudden opened fire. I got no idea who's telling the truth here, but once again, someone ended up dead under mysterious circumstances. And once again, Whisperin Jim was acquitted. Now, the good folks of Sydney, Nebraska weren't really all that fond of all this recent excitement. They ended up forming a vigilance committee, dubbed the Regulators, and soon began rounding up McCarty and his associates. They also arrested another guy named McDonald who'd been accused of robbing stagecoaches. Skip ahead a few nights later, and the vigilantes yanked McDonald out of his jail cell and strung him up. They also got Con McCarty and the others. They didn't lynch him, though. Instead, they just horsewhipped him and ran him out of town. Now, Jim Smith was away on business when Con and his buddies were initially thrown in jail. But as luck would have it, he just so happened to return right around the same time they were sent packing. Upon hearing the news, Smith departed immediately, only to return a couple of days later. And it was assumed by many there in Sydney that he had tracked down McCarty and his buddies and just shot them all dead. He was also assumed to have assisted in McDonald's lynching. Is that true? Once again, I have no idea. But I do know there was enough talk about it that Whisperin Jim ended up hitting the bottle. To once again quote the great Robert D. Arment, the months of stress occasioned by his battles with the McCarty crowd led to some heavy drinking by Smith at this time. The recurrent rumors that he had participated in the McDonald lynching and cold-blooded murder of his enemies seemed to put him in the same class as the criminals, and did nothing to calm his frayed nerves. And yeah, frayed is a bit of an understatement. Smith was very much on edge, and the whiskey certainly didn't help. Case in point, he got drunk one night and started arguing with a couple of Sydney's leading citizens, and things got so heated that he even pulled out his revolver. Thankfully, he didn't use it, but he was arrested again and fined $50 for disturbing the peace. And just as soon as he got let out of jail, the regulators gave him the same treatment they gave McCarty. Kind of. They didn't horsewhip him, but he was told to leave town immediately and did not come back unless he, too, wanted to get strung up from a telegraph pole. He also lost his job with the Union Pacific. That's okay, though. I mean, a man like Smith could always find work. And sure enough, he soon got a job down in New Mexico at the Mescalero Reservation as chief of Indian police. Just not for very long. I'm not really sure what happened. Some accounts claim that he got into an argument with his boss and just quit out of disgust, and others think that Smith was simply fired for being a little too bloodthirsty. Either way, by 1884, he was back in Cheyenne and working for the Wyoming Stock Growers Association. By the way, earlier I mentioned how Smith had gotten married in New Orleans, but by this point, he and his wife were estranged. She didn't accompany him down to New Mexico, and when their marriage was finally dissolved in November of 1895, She claimed that Smith had been willfully absent for years. As far as I know, they never had any children. Another, by the way. I found one source, and one source alone, alleging that Smith backed down Pat Garrett while he was down there in the land of enchantment. Unfortunately, I was not able to verify this. They definitely could have known one another. I mean, Jim began working at the reservation in June of 1881, and if I'm not mistaken, the Apache Reservation at that time was in Lincoln County, the same county that Garrett was sheriff of. I don't think Otero County was formed until a few years later, but please feel free to double check me on that. But yeah, like I said, after leaving New Mexico, Smith went to work for the WSGA as a roving detective. He was essentially a stock detective, but rather than working locally, he was literally just sent all over the place. Colorado, Montana, even as far away as Iowa and Minnesota. For the most part, though, his main area of operations was northwest Nebraska. That's where he was in March of 1885, near the town of Crawford, investigating stock theft. Following month, he was reassigned to Fort Robinson for a brief period, before being sent to Chadron to investigate the wholesale slaughter of cattle belonging to association members. And you may be wondering why it is that people in Nebraska were members of the Wyoming Stock Growers Association. I actually asked myself that very same question, and I don't really have an answer. We do know for a fact that Smith was in the employ of the WSGA, though. I mean, there's all kinds of correspondence between him and Association Secretary Thomas Sturgis. In fact, Sturgis received a letter in late 1885 from fellow WSGA member Bartlett Richards complaining of Smith's behavior. According to Richards, Jim would often visit the local hog ranches, get drunk, and sleep the rest of the day away. He was also setting too low of a value on slaughtered animals, which in turn made it difficult to get convictions. Now, if you're not familiar with the term hog ranch, that was just a popular euphemism for whorehouses that would oftentimes spring up near military installations. As far as the allegations against Smith, he wrote his own letter to Sturgis, giving his side of the story, at least as far as the whores were concerned. According to him, he avoided hog ranches as they were notoriously, quote, the resort of thieves and pimps. But when word spread that he was afraid to enter such an establishment, he felt duty-bound to go, not just once, but for 8 consecutive nights. Said it was only the rumors of him being afraid that caused him to pay a visit in the first place, and that he was far too old to be a customer. Look, I got an uncle, rest in peace, who once visited the infamous chicken ranch down in LaGrange, Texas. But according to him, he waited in the car while his friends went inside. I didn't believe my uncle, and I don't believe Whisperin Jim. But hey, I guess anything's possible, right? Now, eventually Jim would lose his job with the WSGA. The winter of 1886 put a lot of ranchers out of business, and the organizations just didn't have enough money to keep guys like Smith on the payroll. He was highly respected by several of the big ranchers, though, and that being the case, they ended up establishing a special fund in order to retain his services. And by services, I do mean terrorizing all the smaller farmers and ranchers, who they referred to as grangers. This is something I've spoken about extensively here on the podcast. Check out the series I did on Frank Canton, especially the episode regarding Johnson County War. But yeah, the WSGA basically used men like Smith to bully the smaller outfits into submission. Either that or just flat out kill them or chase them out of the territory. Once again, not really much in the way of details regarding this period, and in the end, Smith was officially separated from the WSGA, at least on paper. I'm not really sure if he quit or if he was fired after bringing too much heat or whatever the case, but by 1888, he was once again working for the railroad. Only this time, instead of the Union Pacific, it was the Denver and Rio Grande. He would still occasionally pull jobs for his buddies in the WSGA, though, just in more of an off-record capacity, sort of like muscle for the mob. Now, for the next few years, Smith continued to work as a detective, as well as doing a little bit of prospecting. He also got a job as both head of security for the Pleasant Valley Coal Company and deputy sheriff over in the town of Castlegate, Utah. It wouldn't last for long, though, mostly due to his drinking. He got so drunk at a Christmas party that his own boss, the sheriff, had to place him under arrest. He didn't fire him, though. That particular shoe wouldn't drop until a week later when Jim got drunk again and got into a gunfight with a lawyer. Luckily, nobody got hurt, but Smith was once again arrested. He was charged with assault with the intent to murder, but the case ended up being thrown out due to a technicality. Now, by the turn of the century, Smith had garnered quite the reputation. As I'm sure you can imagine, right? And it was this reputation that called him to Denver during the summer of 1899. You see, the legendary Bat Masterson was also in Denver. He'd invested in a boxing club earlier that spring, but for whatever reason, he and his partners had a falling out. So he started a rival club of his own called the Olympic. This didn't sit too well with the owners of the original club, so they sent for Smith to run Masterson out of town. When Bat heard the news, he called Smith out, but the former detective played coy and, quote, made haste to explain that his purpose in coming to Denver was wholly innocuous, end of quote. Worth noting that Masterson was also writing sports columns for a local newspaper, so he used this platform to issue further warnings. So if Smith so much as made a move in his general direction, then he would personally take it out on the owners of the rival club. Now, eventually, Bat would leave town for New York City, and Smith, years later, during an interview, maintained that it was he who ordered Masterson to leave Denver. He also called Bat a quote-unquote flower flusher, whatever the hell that means, who had an undeserved reputation as a gunfighter. Per Whisperin Jim, quote, it was not my intention to shoot him. That was not necessary. I would merely have kicked him down 17th Street and would have seen to it that he went aboard the train, end of quote. As for Masterson, he would later claim, the fact is, Smith never spoke to me in his life, nor did he ever act as if he desired to. And to be frank about it, if he had looked even as if he wanted to speak with me, I would have shot him as if he were a mad dog, end of quote. Who's telling the truth here? I don't know. I'll let you decide. Believe it or not, Smith would eventually return to Sidney, Nebraska, just passing through, but his visit was noted by a local paper. Quote, James L. Smith passed through this community today en route to Lincoln, where he has business with the governor. He is currently in the employ of the Secret Service of the Stockmen's Association. Older residents recall that he is the man who killed Flanagan here in self-defense and is known as one of the nerviest men ever to wear shoe leather. Now, that was in 1903, so Smith would have been in his mid-60s and still working in law enforcement. And he continued doing so until his demons got to be just a bit too much, and his decline was nothing if not dramatic. To once again quote the great historian, Robert D. Arment, in 1910, at the age of 72, Smith was working as a guard at the Colorado State Reformatory at Buena Vista. But the ravages of his alcoholism continued to plague him, and the final years of his life were spent in poverty. By the way, I've seen some accounts alleging that Smith killed a prisoner who was attempting to escape from the reformatory, but much like many of the other claims, I was unable to verify its veracity. But yeah, just like D. Arment said, things got so bad that by 1914, Smith was homeless. He turned himself in to authorities just out of desperation, saying that he'd been working for a bootlegging operation up in Boulder County. This was a lie. In all reality, Smith was just broke and looking for a warm place to lay his head, and hopefully a little free medical attention. Only thing is, he couldn't get his usual fix of hard liquor behind bars. Smith began suffering from withdrawals, and after just 2 weeks in jail, he attempted to kill himself by slashing his own throat. He was unsuccessful, but he tried again the following month, on August 26, 1914, by swallowing a handful of lye. And this time he got the job done, experiencing what I can only imagine was an extremely painful death. Nobody came forward to claim his body, so Whisperin Jim was laid to rest in a pauper's grave at Denver's Riverside Cemetery. Same place where last week's topic, Mark Dugan, was also buried. Now, regarding his nickname, Whisperin Jim, unfortunately, I was unable to locate an origin story. I don't know if he really whispered or what, but I did find another guy named Whisperin Jim who once ran for sheriff of Maricopa County, Arizona. And this guy got the whispering handle on account of being such a damn loudmouth. Sort of an ironic nickname, right? Like calling a big guy tiny. So I don't know, maybe Smith had the same habit of being a blowhard. By the way, there are no known photos of Whisperin Jim, so please don't be confused by whatever image I end up using as my thumbnail. Usually with most of the people we cover, there are photographs, but when there aren't, I'll try to just use the coolest picture I can find that kind of sort of fits the overall theme. The best we have to go on with Smith is a sketch that appeared in the Denver Times in February of 1905. As to whether or not it's a true likeness, I honestly do not know. And yeah, that's about all I've got on Whisperin Jim Smith. I don't know about you, but I'm always fascinated by these lesser-known Old West figures. And there really were a lot of guys just like Smith. You know, for every Billy the Kid and Jesse James, there were a dozen Whisperin Jims. Men just as deadly, if not more so, but for whatever reason, they just never attained lasting fame. Now, I've never read the novel Whisperin Smith by Frank Spearman. Maybe you have. but it's my understanding that the main protagonist was mostly based on Detective Joe LaForce and another lawman named Tim Kelleher, as opposed to the real-life Whisperin Smith. The book was a bestseller, though. Not only that, but it led to 6 movies with some variation of Whisperin Jim in the title. The most popular seems to have been the one from 1948 starring Alan Ladd, and there was also a miniseries in the 1960s starring Audie Murphy. Now, for research, I mostly relied on Robert K. D'Arment and his book Deadly Dozen, Volume 3. I also consulted his books on Bat Masterson, as well as various articles online. What I did not do was read the book Whisperin Jim, His Life and Misadventures, by Alan Bristow. And the only reason I didn't read it was because I didn't even know it existed until a few hours ago. So if you're interested in learning more, that's probably a great place to start. And if you do read Bristow's book and I got anything wrong, please don't be shy about correcting me. Shoot me an email at josh@wildwestextra.com. All right, thank you so much for joining me. Till next time, try not to join a vigilante posse and hang anyone from a telegraph pole without due process, okay? Don't go picking a fight with Bat Masterson, and please, whatever you do, don't ingest lie. I mean, what the hell, people? Have you not seen Fight Club? All right, till next week, adios.